On this super review live, we're going to take a look at another IEM. This is the Audiosense AQ7. And like the IEM that I reviewed just yesterday, the FH3, this is a hybrid IEM. But unlike that FH3, well, there's a number of things that are pretty different here. So the Audiosense AQ7, if you missed my unboxing a couple of weeks ago, this is Audiosense's flagship IEM, or that's kind of how they're pitching it. And with that comes, I think, a flagship price. The AQ7 is a $500 IEM. And for that $500, what you get is 7 drivers per ear. That's right, that's 7 drivers per ear, just like that. And I don't know, so with those 7 drivers, you got 6 Knowles balance armatures in each ear, as well as a 10mm dynamic driver handling the low end, which is, I don't know, somewhat of a common configuration. I mean, that's a lot of Knowles balance armatures, but otherwise relatively straightforward here. So does this thing live up to the flagship title? Is there something to live up to there? Let's dig into it. So look, this is a live review for the folks here in the live stream. Thank you guys for watching. If you've got any questions that I don't answer during this review, please save them for the end of the review. And at the end of the review, for the folks that are here live, we're gonna have a little live conversation. For the rest of you, I'm going to kind of go through the build and the physical aspects of the AQ7, and then talk about the sound of it, compare it to at least one other IEM that is probably my most comparable. And then I'll give this thing a review. And just for full disclosure, I don't know, I've spent about 2 weeks with this IEM, and I've, at the same time I was reviewing the FIO FH3. But yeah, it's been about 2 weeks with this thing, so I've got a pretty good sense of it. And that wasn't supposed to be an Audiosense jokes, but let's get into it. All right, here we've got the AQ7. And I see someone in the live chat referencing the chonkers, and I think you're kind of right. So we're going to just start by talking about the build, and the chonkiness of it, I think, is one of the things that stands out right away. These IEMs are, they're pretty large, and I don't know, is my finger a good comparison? Probably not. But just the thickness of it is pretty large. In the ear, it doesn't necessarily fit that large, but it is, I think, quite chonker, as you might expect, frankly, for an IEM that is packing in 7 drivers. The plastic shell is clear. You can kind of see inside of it. You can see the dynamic driver in here. And you can see the Knowles balance armatures stuffed up in here, and there's probably even more of them. One thing that's interesting is that the construction of this, I gotta be honest, I don't think it really lives up to the $500 asking price. It just, I don't know, I think it looks a little bit cheap. The plastic here kind of seems like it's solid, right, between the drivers and the ear, but then on the other side of the drivers is just open. I don't know if that's necessarily bad, but I don't know. The plastic is just a little bit on the cloudy side. It's not especially attractive to look at. And, well, I don't know. That's about as much as I could talk about the shells. I mean, out here, if I'm being picky about the aesthetic, frankly, I'm not a big fan of the aesthetic of this IEM either. And I think it's kind of a mess for a couple of reasons. One, I think the look between the shells and then this outer plate is just kind of a mismatch. This just kind of looks messy. It doesn't look particularly intentional, and it definitely, in my opinion, doesn't really go with this kind of smoky, almost blue color. But then you also look at the cable that it comes with, and this cable is the same cable that Audiosense includes on their cheaper IEMs, and I'm not the biggest fan of this cable. It's just a little bit on the lightweight side, which isn't, being lightweight's not necessarily a bad thing, but you might be able to tell that it's a little kinky, which could be a positive thing, depending on what you're into. But yeah, I don't know. I just find it a little bit on the kinky side, a little bit lightweight, kind of feels a little cheap. And then another thing that kind of contributes to, I think, the somewhat cheap feel is down here where these ear guides terminate, it just kind of feels like they stuck straws on the end of this cable. So maybe I'm just being picky, but in my opinion, the build of this thing is just doesn't stand out, and the aesthetic of it does not stand out. At least weight-wise, it's pretty lightweight, which again can be a positive or a negative. You're not going to have any issues with these things staying in your ears in terms of like the weight pulling them out, and yeah, generally it's just a very lightweight IEM. But it doesn't have, I don't know, some other IEMs that have maybe a thicker or a more solid plastic resin shell. Just, it feels a little bit more quality than I think the Audiosense does. We'll do a quick fit test just so I can show you how they fit. And they fit reasonably well. Like I mentioned, they're a little bit on the chonk side. You do get pretty good isolation, but you know, you can kind of see it sticks out a little bit. Not a big deal, I don't think, but you know, worth considering that it's just not the nicest fitting IEM. Something like the Moondrop Blessing, I think is actually, it's going to be the IEM I compare this thing the most to. The Moondrop Blessing, build-wise, I think it looks a lot nicer aesthetically, but just fit-wise, the shape of it is a lot more intentional, and it's bigger in my ear, the Moondrop Blessing is, but I find that it actually fits better for me than the Audiosense. I did also have some issues with getting a consistent seal with this. You might notice, you probably didn't notice, but I'll point it out anyway. I've actually gone with the small tips on the AQ7, which typically I will go with medium tips. So that helped me get a little bit more consistent seal, but I did still have some issues with getting that consistent fit. That's basically all I can say about this package right here. Let's do a quick cable wind just so you can see how neatly it does stack. And you know, the fact that this cable is lightweight and flexible does mean that it doesn't fight you at all, unlike the cable on the Fios that I was playing with yesterday. So it stays nice and neatly packaged, which I guess I appreciate that. I should mention this. I think this is maybe the world's best implementation of a chin cinch, and for that I will definitely give Audiosense credit. So here's their chin cinch, and it's, I think, especially effective for a couple of reasons. One, it's very stiff on the cable. Like, it will not slide down at all. If I try and flick it down, it's going to stay in place. So it holds its place very, very well, which is kind of important for a chin cinch to be effective. The other thing that I think is really cool is if you're not a fan of chin cinches, this thing just kind of compresses into the Y split, and it looks like you don't have a chin cinch at all. So, best of both worlds, in my opinion. I guess I can also talk about the accessories that this thing came with, which for a $500 set, not too bad. Nothing especially stand out, although this case right here is quite large, kind of a Pelican style case. Frankly, much larger than anything I would typically use. This thing, ooh, that's chonky. But it's nicely made, I suppose. And then the selection of tips they give you is pretty massive. I'll be honest, I just stuck with this one sort of range of tips, and again, I stuck with the small sizes, but they do give you foams, and they give you 3 different styles of silicone tips. The reason I went with these ones is, let's see if we can show this on camera. These tips, the ones that I went with over here, just have a little bit more of a rounded shape to them, which in my experience, ear tips, I like these, they'll kind of, you know, get a little bit of extra purchase on the inside of my ear, where this is more of a typical bubble where it's widest at the bottom. Here, this one's widest kind of in the middle, and I personally like that fit. And then of course, Audiosense did also supply a brush for all the gross things that will happen with your earphones when you put them in your ear. And well, didn't mean to make you think about that, but there you go. So that is the build of the Audiosense AQ7, which leaves us to talking about the sound. And with 7 drivers per ear, you might have certain expectations. I don't know, I don't really know what to expect, to be frank. But I think there is quite a bit to like here. The definition between all the sounds is actually really strong on the Audiosense. And I think probably the strongest aspect of the sound on this earphone is the bass. And it's a lot of bass. I typically start by talking about sort of like the tone of the earphone, but I'm actually gonna leave that for, I don't know, the end, but I'm gonna leave that for a little bit later and just kind of talk about what I think this thing does really well. And I think the bass is one of those things that it does really well. It's quite elevated. If you look at a frequency response graph, the AQ7 has quite a bit of bass, but it is, I think, nicely sub-bass focused, and it's pretty tight bass. I think it's not quite as tight and bouncy as the bass on something like the FiO FH3 that I reviewed yesterday, but I do think that it sounds a little bit more natural. And yeah, I don't know. I think the bass here is probably comparable in quality to the FH3, but again, it's a little bit more natural here. I don't think it had any issues with it bleeding into the mid-range or anything like that. In fact, again, we'll get into the tonality a little bit, but the lower mid-range is pretty scooped. And the bass kind of terminates before it gets that far, which is good. The other things that I like about this sound is just, I think I mentioned a little bit, just the general definition and the layering in the sound is pretty strong. Everything is just really tight, and that's good. You might expect that for a $500 IEM, but you don't always get it, and Audiosense has at least done that much. And then I guess the last thing I'll say pretty positively about this sound, this is kind of going to depend on your personal preferences, is that the treble is very relaxed on the AQ7. If you're sensitive to treble, if you find earphones that have, you know, some emphasized treble in them fatiguing and hard to listen to, I don't think you're going to have that issue with the AQ7. So that much, I suppose, is good. So yeah, what this thing excels at is just that definition, the specificity and the control and the layering, and then that bass quality. But I don't love this earphone. In fact, here's the Moondrop Blessing 2. This is an earphone that costs 320 bucks, so quite a bit less than the Audiosense. And in my opinion, the Moondrop Blessing 2 does just about everything better. And the main thing that it does better is the tonal response is just, the Moondrop Blessing 2 tonality is almost, I would say this is basically exactly to my liking. The Audiosense is interesting. So this is a very, I described the bass as being pretty emphasized, and it is. The bass is one of the dominating characteristics, but it doesn't necessarily come across as a warm sounding earphone. In fact, this, I think the Audiosense AQ7 sounds kind of like a mid-forward. It's very mid-forward, very upper mid-forward. The lower mids they're a little bit scooped, but it's kind of interesting, and I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into a frequency response graph, but when I look at this thing on a frequency response graph, the upper mid-range boost that you get on the AQ7 happens at a different point than you would normally expect it. Something like the Moondrop Blessing 2, this is a good example of a very typical upper mid-range boost or pinna gain, where you'll have a relatively flat frequency response up to about 1,000 hertz, and then you get that rise to about 2,000 to 3,000 hertz. Here in the Audiosense, curiously, that upper mid-range lift actually starts much sooner than 1,000 hertz. The upper mid-range lift starts here at like, I don't know, like 600 hertz, which, again, maybe I'm reading too much into the frequency response graph and kind of like transposing that on my audio impressions, but it does come across as slightly funky in the mid-range, which is actually, interestingly, something I didn't totally notice when I was only listening to music that was like vocals and electronics. Vocals and electronic music, I think the Audiosense AQ7, the things that are nice about this, I think you can appreciate. But when it comes to more analog instruments, guitars, drums, snares, stuff like that, that's where the tonal funkiness of this, I think, stands out quite a bit, and where something like the Moondrop Blessing 2 really excels. Yeah, it's a little weird in the mid-range, and I think even bigger problem for me specifically is that treble roll-off. There is a very surprising amount of treble roll-off, to the point that like hi-hats and, again, analog instruments, especially things like hi-hats, they sound kind of off. They almost sound like salt shakers or something like that. So I didn't have a great experience with analog music. So let's say some examples, some very specific examples of stuff that actually sounded pretty decent on the AQ7. Sylvan Esso, they've just got a new album that just came out. I think that album sounds pretty good on the Audiosense. It's a relatively brightly mastered album, and because the treble in here is pretty relaxed, there's zero fatigue. And you know, it's all electronic music, so it suits, I think, this earphone fairly well. But then music that didn't sound so great on the Audiosense, or where the tonal issues kind of rear their heads in, stuff like Queen's Hot Space album, or what was I listening to earlier today? Tracy Chapman, I think it's her self-titled album. These are all just, you know, analog instruments, guitars and drums, and that's where I think the tonal gap between these things is pretty massive. And I think for $320, the Moondrop Blessing 2 is a great buy. And I think at $500 with the Audiosense, if you want a lot of bass, this definitely has more bass than the Moondrop Blessing. And it's pretty decent bass. It's pretty solid bass. And if you're afraid of treble, well, the Audiosense I think will, again, maybe be better than the Moondrop Blessing, which isn't necessarily a especially bright earphone, but its treble it's not rolled off. But otherwise, I think that pretty much everyone's going to prefer the sound of the Moondrop Blessing. I think I didn't mention this, or I should have mentioned this. That treble roll-off in the Audiosense, I think, also does take away a little bit of the precision in the audio image, where the layering and like the definition in the sounds is actually pretty strong here. Again, that's one of the things I think the Audiosense does quite well. But when I compared it head-to-head with the Blessing 2, it wasn't necessarily that the sounds were more defined, but that their position was definitely more distinct here on the Blessing 2. And I think a lot of that just comes down to the treble response, frankly. So yeah, that is the Audiosense AQ7. Out of 5 stars, I don't think it's bad. I think out of 5 stars, I'm still going to give it 3 stars. It's just, I think for $500, you kind of have certain high expectations. And I think that in terms of build quality and aesthetic and fit, it's only okay, in my opinion. And then when you get to the sound, it does have some pretty strong attributes to it. The bass response is strong, and the definition, there's no smearing or anything across the frequency response, so that much is very good. It's very well controlled. I just think that tonally, at $500, well, yeah, at $500, I have expectations for something a little better like the Moondrop Blessing 2. So that is my review of the Audiosense AQ7. If you're interested in checking it out, I do have links in the description down below. And if you found this video helpful, useful, entertaining, if you just didn't think this video sucked, go ahead and hit the like button. You can subscribe to the channel, and if you want to be a part of the next live stream Q&A, please ding the bell so that YouTube lets you know when I'm live. When I'm live, we'll have a conversation. For the folks that are watching this not live, that is the end of this review. Thank you for watching. For the folks who are live, let's stick around and chat.